Hello everybody, welcome back to the Ancient Oak, where we are discussing the journey from Christianity into paganism. If you watch the introduction video, then you've already got an idea of what we are doing here. So I won't rehash that, we'll just go right into it. So I woke up this morning and the thing I wanted to talk about, I think that was maybe on my mind after I made the video yesterday, was the idea of what originally drew me away from Protestant Christianity and then into the Catholic Church or the Eastern Orthodox Church later on. I think what I found to be the most compelling case, and I'm not going to make this a channel about Christian theology, if that wasn't obvious enough. That's not my thing anymore, but I definitely spent a lot of time studying it, so I think I can at least talk on it with some level of complexity. The reason I initially came into the more traditional, you could say traditional branches of Christianity was what I was looking for was something ancient, something that was older than myself, or older than American history, older than even Protestant Reformation history. And what you find in a lot of the evangelical Protestant churches is a pretty modern interpretation of the way Christianity is practiced. For the first 1500 years of Christianity, there was no such thing as Protestantism, and everybody was more or less on the same page dogmatically about what it meant to be a Christian. There have always been variations going back all the way to the early Gnostic sects, and that's another discussion, but generally speaking, by and large, the Christian population of the world would have fallen into two broader categories of Roman Catholic or Eastern Orthodox. Now, with those two different traditions, you have to accept a whole bunch of dogmas that come with that. In order to become Catholic, you do have to accept very specific dogmas. Transubstantiation, belief that the bread and the wine truly and literally become the body and blood of Christ. The Immaculate Conception of Mary, the virgin birth, the resurrection, though those are things common to other Christian sects too. You have to accept a hierarchical structure of the church that includes bishops, patriarchs, and in the case of the Roman Catholic Church, an ultimate head to the church being the Pope of Rome. So you have to sort of accept these things, but I found it easier once I started doing the historical research into Christianity that those things made sense. If you go back and dig around in books written by people in the 1st, 3rd, 4th century, what you find looks absolutely nothing like modern day American Protestant Christianity and looks everything like traditional Catholicism or Orthodoxy. You have a priesthood, you have sacraments, you have a more mysterious view of the world that isn't as rational. Protestantism I always found to be a very rational, heady faith, where in the Catholic and Orthodox Church there's a lot more emphasis on the heart, though in the Catholic Church there's a very strong rational and intellectual tradition, and there is an orthodoxy as well, though in the Orthodox Church it leans a lot more toward the mystical elements from the writings of the saints. So what I was looking for was something old, something ancient, something outside of time and space and of myself that I could point to and say, this is old, this is established, this is something that I can just plug myself into. I don't need to reinvent the wheel. I can just sort of whole hog accept all of these teachings, and then within those teachings I can work out my own sort of my own salvation, as they say. So that leads me briefly, and again, we're going to dive deeper into these topics, but I'm still trying to just offer an overview of how I got here. So all of this to say, I think one of the main things that you often hear about Wicca in particular is that it is not an ancient faith, that it is, in fact, it's one of the most modern, new you would say, religious systems. And though some people might disagree whether it's a religious system, but in terms of what I'm being taught and how I've come to understand this, it's most certainly a religious system. Now, that doesn't mean you have to believe anything in particular about the nature of gods or a god, but it most certainly is a system of religion. So I think a lot of people make the obvious and true observation that Wicca, in its current form, in terms of the British traditional witchcraft form, was started in the 1940s into the 50s by Gerald Gardner and people who were associated with him. Of course, Gardner would make the claim that he was drawing on more ancient pagan European practices. This is obviously debated by scholars pretty hotly. I tend to believe, from the research I've done, that yes, Wicca is a modern interpretation of an ancient system of belief, which is why some people very much prefer the term paganism, because that would be referring to the earlier pre-Christian polytheistic religions that existed in Europe prior to the spread of Christianity. So this goes to my point of, well, if I was looking for something ancient in the Christian church, why turn to something so modern in the Wiccan practices? And this is a fair observation, but what I've had to do is I've had to really rethink what it means to find something ancient, or what it means to plug into something older than myself. I think in my experience there's been something at a gut level that feels very ancient about the way Wiccans practice their faith. It's almost as if one is sort of projecting themselves back into a period of time in pre-Christian Europe, because surely these people all over Europe were not Christian from all eternity. They were Stone Age people who were, much like everybody around the world, were grasping for any sort of ideas they could to explain the natural world around them. What was lightning? Why were there earthquakes? Why are all of my children dying of malaria? They reached out to whatever they could develop, and they developed a system of different gods, a pantheon that would explain the various effects and impacts that were happening in their life. Now, this is an interesting rabbit hole to go down, because I think within the Wiccan tradition there is, I think thankfully, a lot of freedom in what you can believe about the nature of the gods. You don't have to be a theist whatsoever to be a Wiccan. And in fact, I don't even know at this point what I believe about the nature of God or gods. What I do know is that we definitely have these archetypes in our society and in our minds. We are almost, not all of us, but I feel like a great majority of people are almost born with this intuitive sense that there's something beyond them. Now, that could mean that all religions in the world have been completely made up, and gods, Yahweh, Zeus, doesn't matter, have all been our projections onto the world to make sense of what's going on around us. I think the more interesting question is, does that make it not true, or does the power of belief create what is true? Because we're really shaping this world ourselves, and we can, through our own thoughts, manifest into this world things that become real. Now, can that happen with a god? Can that happen with a supernatural entity? I think nobody knows. I think there's no possible way to answer this question, and anyone who tries to sell you on the idea that they've discovered some sort of information about this that you just don't have access to yet is probably gonna next ask for your money. So going back, yeah, so what it means to be a part of something ancient. I'd like to look at what I did in journeying from Christianity into Wicca as a stepping into the void of darkness. I left the Orthodox Christian Church, like I said, a little over 2 years ago, after I had a complete abandonment of any future plans of becoming a monk. I was firmly fixed and convinced that this was no longer what I was intended to do with my life, and I'm very thankful that I finally came to that understanding. It took me a while, but I found a lot of peace with letting that go. So at that point, I sort of went into a period of complete unbelief. I dug as deep as I could into really listening to a lot of what you would describe as new atheist thinkers, people like Christopher Hitchens, Sam Harris, and Richard Dawkins. I think a lot of people turn to those thinkers as their initial source of information because they're incredibly prominent all over YouTube, and their books have been popular for decades. But I had to sort of grapple with the idea that I left the process behind of becoming a monk in the Christian church. And so I sort of asked myself, well, what else can I let go of? If it was possible to let go of what I thought was my life's calling dictated by God, then what else could I let go of? So that's what I set off to explore, is letting go, just shedding all of my preconceived beliefs about Christianity, things that I had just taken to be true at face value, and seeing how I could dissect them, defeat the arguments. And I hate to be the bearer of bad news to some people, but it really wasn't that hard of a mission. I think once you take a step back out of the Christian bubble and really start evaluating some of these things, it becomes pretty apparent that you've been believing things that are, in any other context, nothing short of what we would say absolutely magical. And you can't really believe these things almost without believing in a set of magical circumstances. And I'm not saying that's a bad thing. I actually still agree with that. But as you know, to quote Sam Harris, he has known his saying is known to say that if you believe that saying a certain set of Latin words over your pancakes turns them into the body of Elvis Presley, then you're insane. But if you believe roughly the same thing about bread and wine, then you're just a normal Catholic. And I think that's completely true. He hit the nail on the head. I would have, back when I was a Christian, I would have looked at practices like Wicca or witchcraft or any sort of occult Western esoteric tradition, and I would have looked at that and said, well, that's bizarre. They're performing rituals and wearing certain garments and all of these different things that go along with the Western tradition of magic. And you would have said, well, I would have said, well, this looks all absolutely bananas. But of course, to any other person looking in on a traditional Christian perspective, you see what? You see the same thing. You see a bunch of people dressed in robes, performing rituals, using incense, lighting candles, and I guess one has to ask themselves, really, well, what is the difference? Now, the difference is what you believe about what you're doing. Because if you believe that what you're doing in the context of that ritual, as a Christian, is worshiping the one true God that only exists, then of course it doesn't seem absurd. But once you're willing to take that step and at least ask yourself, well, was I wrong about there being only one God? Was I just in a bubble of my own making and of my own culture, surrounded by people who I agree with? And did that influence everything I thought? And I think This is not a revelatory bit of information here. I think a lot of people probably have thoughts like this maybe earlier on in their life. Maybe I'm later to the game, but I was heavily invested in being a Christian, and I didn't want to let that go. So I think you could say, well, I think a lot of people would say, a lot of people I still know today would say, well, why not just let it all go? Why not abandon the idea of practicing a religion altogether? Why not just be an atheist? Why not believe in science and let it be at that? Say, I don't know. Well, I still say, I don't know. And I think I'll always, hopefully, continue to say, I don't know the answer to anything about the nature of God or religion. All I can speak to is my own personal journey, and what else can a person do, you know? We can only speak for ourselves, and that's the extent of what I'm trying to do, is just speak for myself, speak my own personal truth, and if that resonates with anybody, so be it. This is a story that I'm telling and a journey that I'm going through, but I'm doing this because I hope that I can offer, again, someone out there, someone to relate to, because I have found in my journey out of Christianity into Wicca one thing that has become incredibly obvious. There are a ton of videos on the internet about people who are converting to Christianity. Right now, it's incredibly popular for people to talk about Catholicism and Orthodoxy. And there's a lot of people who are, I think, looking at more traditional forms of Christianity. So you have a plethora of conversion stories. But one thing a priest always told me that stuck with me is everybody likes to talk about how many people are coming in the front door. What nobody likes to talk about is how many people leave out the back. And that I have seen to be incredibly true. I think there's a lot of conversation about coming into the faith. There's not enough conversation about what it is to leave the faith. Now, I'm looking at a particular specific thing here because I'm leaving the faith, going into another one, so slightly more niche, but I think it might be able to speak to some people out there. So yeah, I'll leave it at that. Thank you guys for watching, and I will see you at the next video.